The rain hammered against the cracked windows of Mel's diner like desperate fingers seeking shelter, each drop a tiny percussion in the symphony of another dreary Tuesday morning. Sarah Chen wiped down the same vinyl booth for the third time, her calloused hands moving in practice circles while her mind wandered to the pile of unpaid bills tucked beneath her mattress at home. The fluorescent light above flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the worn linoleum floor that had seen better decades. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. At 28, Sarah had the kind of face that revealed every sleepless night. Dark circles beneath her almond-shaped eyes, worry lines etched prematurely around her mouth, and a weariness that seemed to settle in her bones like winter cold. Her uniform, a faded pink dress with Mel's Diner embroidered in cursive across the pocket, hung loose on her diminishing frame. She'd been working double shifts for 3 months now, ever since her mother's medical bills had multiplied like hungry weeds. The bell above the entrance chimed weakly as Detective Marcus Rodriguez pushed through the door, his shoulders heavy with rain and something heavier still. Sarah's face brightened with genuine warmth, one of the few authentic smiles she managed each day. Marcus had been coming here for 2 years, ever since his divorce, ordering the same black coffee and wheat toast, leaving the same generous tip despite Sarah's protests. "Morning, Detective," Sarah called, already reaching for the coffee pot. "Rough night?" Marcus settled into his usual corner booth, the one with a clear view of both entrances and the kitchen. Old cop habits died hard. His weathered hands wrapped around the steaming mug she placed before him, and for a moment, the simple warmth seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders. "Found another one last night," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 18 years on the force. "Homeless guy, maybe 60, froze to death behind the grocery store. Had a photograph in his pocket. Little girl, probably his granddaughter. Smiling face, missing teeth." Sarah's heart clenched. She'd seen too many faces like that, people who'd slipped through society's cracks until they became invisible. The city had a way of consuming people, grinding them down until they were nothing more than statistics in police reports and social worker files. "What was his name?" she asked, refilling Marcus's cup without being asked. "That's just it. We don't know. No ID, no one to claim him. He'll be buried in Potter's Field with a number instead of a name." Marcus stared into his coffee as if searching for answers in its dark depths. "Sometimes I wonder if we're fighting a war we can't win." Before Sarah could respond, the bell chimed again, and both their heads turned toward the sound. Through the rain-streaked glass, a figure moved slowly, deliberately, each step measured and careful. She had seen him before, the man with the weathered crutches and the story written in scars across his face. Thomas Whitmore paused at the entrance, shaking rainwater from his worn jacket. At 52, he carried himself with a dignity that poverty couldn't quite erase, though it had certainly tried. His left leg, twisted from an accident that had stolen his previous life, dragged slightly as he maneuvered through the tables. The crutches, wooden and worn smooth by years of use, had become extensions of himself, tools that spoke of adaptation rather than defeat. Sarah had first noticed him 6 months ago, sitting on the bench across the street during her afternoon shifts. He never begged, never held a cardboard sign or rattled a cup of coins. He simply sat, watching the world pass by with eyes that seemed to hold both profound sadness and inexplicable hope. There was something about him that tugged at her heart. Maybe it was the way he always nodded respectfully to everyone who passed, or how he'd carefully fold and pocket any litter that blew near his bench. "Table for one?" Sarah asked gently as Thomas approached the counter. She'd learned that treating him the same courtesy she'd offer any customer seemed to matter to him. "Actually," Thomas said, his voice carrying traces of an education that hadn't been completely worn away by circumstance, "I was wondering if I might sit by the window. The rain makes beautiful patterns on the glass." There was poetry in the way he spoke, as if he understood that beauty could be found in the simplest observations. Sarah led him to a table near the front window, where the gray morning light filtered through the rain-streaked glass, creating an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of shadows and reflections. "Coffee to start?" she offered, though she knew he'd nurse 1 cup for hours, making it last like a small treasure. "That would be lovely. Thank you." As Sarah poured the coffee, she noticed Thomas's hands, clean despite his circumstances, with neat fingernails and calluses that spoke of careful maintenance of his few possessions. His clothes were patched but clean, his hair combed with the kind of precision that suggested personal standards that poverty hadn't conquered. "Sarah," Marcus called from his booth, "do you hear about the community meeting tonight? They're talking about the homeless situation again." She glanced back at the detective, then at Thomas, who had suddenly gone very still. The political discussions about homelessness always seemed to dance around the actual human beings living it, reducing complex stories to simple problems with simple solutions.
"What kind of meeting?" Thomas asked quietly, his fingers tightening around his coffee cup. "City Council," Marcus replied. Not unkindly, but with the weariness of someone who'd attended too many such meetings. "Business owners are complaining about the camp under the overpass. They want it cleared out before the holidays bring more tourists downtown." Thomas nodded slowly, a gesture that seemed to carry years of understanding about how these discussions typically ended. Sarah found herself studying his profile as he gazed out the window, noting the intelligence in his eyes, the way he held himself despite his circumstances. There was a mystery there, layers of story that didn't quite fit the simple narrative of a man down on his luck. The morning rush began in earnest then, with office workers seeking caffeine and carbohydrates to fuel their daily battles. Sarah moved between tables like a dancer who'd memorized every step, refilling cups, taking orders, offering smiles that were part genuine warmth and part professional necessity. Through it all, she remained aware of Thomas at his window table, watching the rain and the passing people with the kind of attention that suggested he was seeing stories in every face. During a brief lull, she approached his table with the coffee pot. "More coffee?" "Please." Thomas looked up at her with gratitude that seemed disproportionate to such a small kindness. "Sarah, isn't it? I've heard the other customers use your name." "That's right. And you're Thomas?" He seemed surprised that she knew, then pleased. "How did you—" "Detective Rodriguez ran your description through missing persons after you helped Mrs. Patterson find her wallet last week. Just checking to make sure you weren't, well, that someone wasn't looking for you." Thomas's expression shifted, revealing something that might have been relief, mixed with another emotion Sarah couldn't quite identify. "And was someone looking for me?" "No," she said softly. "No one was looking." The words hung between them like a bridge neither was quite ready to cross. Sarah had meant to be reassuring, but she realized how that might sound to someone who seemed to exist in the margins of society, unnoticed and unclaimed. I have a daughter," Thomas said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Somewhere, we lost touch after the accident." Sarah felt her heart twist. She wanted to ask more, to understand the story behind the sadness in his eyes, but the lunch rush was beginning, and Mel's voice boomed from the kitchen, calling for orders. As the day wore on, Sarah found herself returning to Thomas's table whenever possible, refilling his coffee, bringing him a piece of pie she claimed was leftover, but had actually paid for herself. There was something about him that reminded her of her father, who'd worked construction until a fall had changed everything. Maybe it was the dignity in the face of hardship, or the way he thanked her for every small kindness as if it were a gift. Near closing time, as Sarah was counting her tips, $14.37, barely enough for tomorrow's bus fare, Thomas approached the counter. He moved slowly, his crutches clicking against the linoleum in a rhythm she'd come to recognize. "Sarah," he reached into his jacket pocket, "I want you to have this." He placed a small object on the counter, a compass, brass and beautiful, though tarnished with age. The face was cracked, and the needle quivered slightly, but it still pointed north true. "I can't take this," Sarah protested, but Thomas was already backing away. "It belonged to my grandfather. He always said it would help you find your way home when you were lost. Maybe it will serve you better than it served me." Before she could respond, he was gone, moving out into the rain with careful, measured steps. Sarah held the compass in her palm, feeling its weight, wondering about the hands that had held it before hers and the journeys it had witnessed. Marcus approached the counter, leaving money for his coffee. "Interesting guy," he said, watching through the window as Thomas disappeared into the evening shadows. "There's more to his story than meets the eye." "What do you mean?" "Just a feeling. In my line of work, you learn to read people. He carries himself like someone who's used to being in charge, used to making decisions. The way he observes everything, takes mental notes, could be military background, could be something else entirely." As Sarah locked up the diner that night, she found herself thinking about Thomas's words and the compass in her pocket. The city felt different somehow, charged with possibility and questions that didn't yet have answers. She didn't know that this was the beginning of something that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone around her. The rain had stopped, but the streets still gleamed with reflected neon and streetlight. Somewhere in the city, Thomas was finding shelter for the night, carrying secrets that would soon reshape everything Sarah thought she knew about kindness, dignity, and the invisible threads that connect us all. Sarah's alarm buzzed at 5:30 a.m., the same relentless electronic shriek that had punctuated her mornings for the past 4 years. She rolled over in her narrow bed, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back from the cheap mattress and too many hours on her feet. The studio apartment she rented for $800 a month was barely larger than some people's closets, but it was hers, and in a city where homelessness sprawled across every underpass and park bench, having 4 walls and a door that locked felt like luxury. The morning ritual never varied. Instant coffee, the generic brand from the dollar store, and 2 pieces of wheat bread, toasted until they were just shy of burnt because that's how long it took her to shower and dress in the shared bathroom down the hall. Mrs. Kowalski from 2B was usually finishing up her morning routine just as Sarah began hers, and they'd exchange tired smiles and comments about the weather or the landlord's latest excuse for not fixing the hot water heater. "You're too good to that place," Mrs. Kowalski said this particular Wednesday morning, her Polish accent still thick after 30 years in America. "Mel, he pays you nothing, works you like horse." She knew she was right, but jobs weren't exactly abundant for someone without a college degree and with a gap in her resume from the 2 years she'd spent caring for her dying mother. Mel's diner wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and in her experience, steady was more valuable than prestigious. The bus ride to work took her through 3 distinct neighborhoods, each telling its own story of urban evolution. First, the gentrifying arts district, where young professionals jogged past murals that celebrated a grittier past they'd never experienced. Then through the industrial corridor, where warehouse workers gathered at bus stops with lunchboxes and thermos bottles, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion of night shifts. Finally, downtown, where gleaming office buildings stood like monuments to ambition, their lobbies filled with people whose biggest daily worry was whether the coffee cart would have their preferred blend. Sarah pressed her face to the bus window each morning, watching these separate worlds blur together, wondering about the invisible boundaries that kept people in their assigned places. She'd once dreamed of working in one of those glass towers back when she'd been pre-med at the community college, before her father's accident, before her mother's diagnosis, before responsibility had narrowed her world to the space between survival and exhaustion. Mel's diner occupied a corner that had somehow resisted the tide of urban renewal washing over downtown. Sandwiched between a boutique that sold $70 candles and a coffee shop that charged more for a single latte than Sarah made in tips some days, the diner existed in a temporal bubble where prices and expectations remained frozen in amber. Mel Kowalski, no relation to her neighbor, had owned the place for 22 years. A bear of a man with hands like baseball mitts and a vocabulary that would make longshoremen blush, he ran the kitchen with military precision despite his gruff exterior. Sarah had learned to read the subtle signs of his moods. The way he arranged his knives predicted whether it would be a day of gentle teasing or irritated silence. The way he hummed old country songs meant he was thinking about his late wife, Rosa, whose photograph still hung beside the register. "Coffee is weak today," announced Betty Morrison, settling into her usual booth with the theatrical sigh of someone who'd perfected the art of complaint. At 73, Betty had been coming to Mel's longer than Sarah had been alive, treating the place like her personal dining room and Sarah like a granddaughter who never quite met expectations. "I'll make a fresh pot," Sarah replied, though they both knew Betty would find something else to criticize within minutes. It was their morning dance, as predictable as sunrise. As Sarah went through the motions of her opening routine, checking the coffee levels, wiping down already clean tables, adjusting the ancient radio until it found a station that came through clearly, her mind wandered to the compass Thomas had given her. She'd placed it on her nightstand, and this morning she'd found herself studying it while she drank her coffee, tracing the crack in its face with her fingertip. There had been something in his eyes when he'd given it to her, a weight of significance that made her feel like she was holding more than just a broken navigation tool. She'd grown up in a family that believed objects could carry stories, that items passed between hands held the intentions and hopes of their previous owners. Her grandmother called it memory made manifest, though she had always assumed it was just another piece of folklore from the old country.
The morning rush at Mel's had its own ecosystem. The construction workers who needed fuel before heading to job sites across the city. The office workers who'd calculated that Mel's coffee and Danish cost half what they'd pay at the trendy places. The retirees who came as much for human contact as for food, lingering over coffee and newspapers like it was their job to keep the world properly observed and commented upon. Detective Rodriguez arrived at his usual time, settling into his corner booth with the newspaper and the particular exhaustion of someone whose job involved cleaning up humanity's messes. Sarah poured his coffee without being asked, adding just enough cream to turn it the color of café au lait. "Any word on that homeless man from yesterday?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure why. She dealt with enough sadness without borrowing more from police reports. Marcus looked up from the paper, his expression grim. Turns out he had a name after all. Walter Hendricks, 64, former military. His daughter came forward after seeing the story in the paper. He paused, stirring his coffee slowly. She'd been looking for him for 3 years. The weight of that information settled on Sarah like a blanket she didn't want. 3 years of searching. 3 years of wondering, ended by a newspaper story about a man who died alone behind a grocery store. She thought about Thomas, sitting at his table by the window, watching the world pass by. Did someone, somewhere, wonder what had happened to him? The door chimed, and as if summoned by her thoughts, Thomas entered. His morning routine had become as predictable as her own over the past months. The careful navigation between tables, the respectful nod to other customers, the selection of a seat that gave him the best view of both the street and the diner's interior. Sarah had noticed that he positioned himself where he could observe without being observed, a habit that suggested either caution born of vulnerability or the instincts of someone accustomed to responsibility. "Good morning, Thomas," she said, approaching his table with the coffee pot. She'd stopped asking if he wanted coffee. He always did, and the ritual of the question and answer seemed less important than the warmth in his smile when she remembered his name. "Good morning, Sarah. Beautiful day, isn't it?" She glanced out the window, at the gray sky and the trash blowing down the sidewalk, but Thomas was looking at something else. A young mother, pushing a stroller, stopping to let her toddler chase pigeons that scattered like leaves in the wind. The child's laughter was audible even through the window, pure joy that transformed the mundane street corner into something magical. "Yes," Sarah said, seeing it through his eyes. "It really is." As the morning progressed, Sarah found herself increasingly aware of the small dramas playing out around her. Betty Morrison, complaining about her coffee, but leaving a $5 tip on a $3 bill because she knew Sarah was saving for her mother's headstone. Marcus Rodriguez, reading about crimes and tragedies, but always asking about Sarah's health, her mother's memory,
her plans for the future, with the gentle concern of someone who'd learned that kindness was the only real weapon against despair. And Thomas, nursing his single cup of coffee, watching the street with the kind of attention that suggested he was cataloging stories in every passing face. When a homeless woman walked by, pushing a shopping cart filled with her possessions, Thomas reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill, catching her eye through the window and pointing toward the diner's entrance. "Excuse me, Sarah, would it be possible to buy a meal for someone who might not be able to pay?" Sarah glanced toward the window where the woman waited, uncertainty written across her weathered face. "Of course. Mel has a policy. No one goes hungry if we can help it." Thomas nodded toward the woman, who approached the door hesitantly. Sarah went to meet her, speaking in low, reassuring tones about hot coffee and fresh soup, treating her with the same courtesy she'd offer any paying customer. As the woman settled into a booth, Sarah noticed Thomas watching the interaction with an expression that seemed to hold both approval and something deeper. Recognition, perhaps, of shared experience.
Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got when well-meaning customers asked about her real career or when her high school classmates posted updates about their promotions and achievements on social media. But there was something in Thomas's question that was different, not judgment, but genuine curiosity about the path that had led her here. "I was pre-med once," she said, surprised by her own honesty. "Community college, then planning to transfer to the state university. I had it all mapped out, medical school, residency, maybe pediatrics or family practice. What happened? Life happened. My father fell from a construction scaffold when I was 20. Spinal injury, disability, depression. Then my mother got sick. Cancer, the slow kind that takes years to kill you and cost everything you have trying to fight it." Sarah traced patterns on the table with her finger, not meeting Thomas's eyes. "By the time she died, I'd used up my savings, maxed out my credit cards, and hadn't been in school for 2 years. Starting over felt impossible." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Do you ever think about going back?" "Every day," Sarah admitted. "But thinking and doing are different things. I'm 28. I'd be starting medical school at 32, if I could even get in. Residency at 36. I'd be older than most attendings when I finally finish training. And that matters?" The question caught her off guard. "Doesn't it? I once knew a woman who went to law school at 45. She'd been a secretary for 20 years, raised 3 children, buried a husband. Everyone told her she was too old to start over. She became a federal judge at 62. He smiled, and Sarah saw something in his expression that suggested this wasn't just a story he'd heard, but a memory he'd lived. Age is just time, Sarah. Time you have to fill with something. The question is whether you fill it with regret or with purpose. Before Sarah could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and a group of business executives entered the space, their expensive suits and confident voices filling like an occupying force. Sarah rose automatically, reaching for menus, but not before she caught the look that passed across Thomas's face, a flicker of something that might have been recognition or perhaps distaste. As she served the new customers, fielding their complaints about the limited wine list and requests for modifications to menu items, Sarah found herself thinking about Thomas's words. The executives treated her with the casual dismissiveness reserved for service workers, speaking around her rather than to her, discussing deals and strategies as if she were furniture with the ability to bring food. When she returned to Thomas's table, he was watching the business lunch with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Friends of yours?" she asked lightly. Thomas's laugh was dry, without humor. "Not exactly, though I recognized the type." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. I used to be them in another life. What kind of work did you do? For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. His eyes grew distant, focused on something beyond the rain-streaked window, beyond the present moment. I built things, mostly companies. I was good at seeing what people needed and finding ways to give it to them. I thought I was making the world better, more efficient, more connected. He smiled ruefully. Turns out efficiency and connection aren't the same thing as kindness or compassion. Sarah wanted to ask more, to understand the journey that had brought him from corporate success to his current circumstances. But the afternoon was slipping away, and there were tables to clear, dishes to wash, preparations for the dinner shift that would begin in a few hours. As closing time approached, Sarah tallied her tips, $18.43, enough for groceries and bus fare with a little left over. Thomas had long since finished his coffee, but he remained at his table, watching the street grow quiet as the business day ended. "Thomas," Sarah said, approaching with the coffee pot one last time, "where do you go at night?" The question surprised them both. Sarah hadn't meant to ask it so directly, but something about the approaching evening made her think about warmth and safety, about the luxury of having a place to return to. "There's a shelter downtown, St. Mary's. They have beds for 30 people, and I'm usually lucky enough to get one." Sarah thought about her small apartment, about the spare blanket in her closet, about the couch that folded out into a bed. The thought of inviting Thomas to stay with her crossed her mind, but she pushed it away. She barely knew him, and kindness had limits dictated by safety and social convention.
"The weather's supposed to turn cold tonight," she said instead. "I'll be fine," Thomas replied, with the kind of certainty that came from experience. "I've weathered worse storms than this." As he prepared to leave, gathering his jacket and positioning his crutches, Sarah found herself wanting to say something more, to bridge the gap between concern and action, between sympathy and actual help. Instead, she pressed a container of leftover soup into his hands, ignoring his protests. "For later," she said, "when you get hungry." Thomas looked at her for a long moment, his eyes holding gratitude mixed with something that looked like sorrow. "Thank you, Sarah, for the soup, for the coffee, for treating me like a human being. You have no idea how rare that is." After he left, Sarah finished her closing routine with unusual thoughtfulness. She found herself thinking about invisible people, about the stories that walked past her window every day without being noticed or acknowledged. She thought about dreams deferred and paths not taken, about the difference between surviving and living. The compass Thomas had given her sat on the counter where she'd placed it while clearing tables. She picked it up, feeling its weight, watching the needle swing toward magnetic north with unwavering determination. Even cracked and tarnished, it still knew its purpose, still pointed the way home. As she locked the diner and headed for the bus stop, Sarah made a decision that surprised her with its clarity. Tomorrow, she would start researching what it would take to go back to school. Not just thinking about it, but actually taking the first steps toward reclaiming the future she'd set aside. She didn't know that across town, Thomas was sitting on his narrow cot in St. Mary's shelter, staring at his own hands and remembering what it felt like to sign checks that could change people's lives. She didn't know that he'd recognized one of the executives from lunch, or that their casual dismissal of her had stirred something in him that had been dormant for too long. But she did know, with the certainty of that magnetic compass needle, that something was beginning to change. In her life, in her understanding of what was possible, in the very air around her that seemed charged with potential. The bus arrived, its doors opening with a pneumatic sigh, and Sarah stepped aboard carrying dreams she was finally ready to pursue.
The next morning arrived with the kind of bitter cold that turned breath into visible clouds and made every step on the pavement ring like struck metal. Sarah hurried toward Mel's diner, her thin jacket insufficient armor against the wind that seemed to slice through downtown's concrete canyons with surgical precision. She'd spent half the night researching community college programs and financial aid options, filling out preliminary applications by the light of her phone to save on electricity. The hope that had carried her to sleep felt more fragile in daylight, worn thin by the reality of minimum wage mathematics and the calculating voice in her head that sounded suspiciously like her late mother. Dreams don't pay bills, Sarah. Dreams don't put food on the table. Thomas was already at his usual spot when she arrived. But something was different. He sat straighter than usual, his weathered hands folded on the table with the precision that spoke of military training or boardroom discipline. His clothes were the same, worn but clean, but he wore them with an authority that hadn't been there before. "Morning, Thomas," Sarah said, approaching with the coffee pot. "You're early today." "Couldn't sleep," he replied, accepting the steaming cup with a nod of thanks. "I've been thinking about our conversation yesterday, about dreams and timing and second chances." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks. She'd revealed more to this near stranger than she'd had to friends she'd known for years, and now she felt exposed, vulnerable in a way that made her want to retreat into the safety of professional politeness. "I might have gotten a little carried away," she said, wiping down a table that was already clean. "It's easy to talk about big changes. Actually making them is different."
Is it? Thomas's voice carried a challenge that made her look up. Or do we just tell ourselves it is to avoid the discomfort of growth? Before Sarah could respond, a morning rush began with unusual intensity. The construction crews arrived earlier than normal, stamping their feet and blowing on their hands, ordering extra coffee and breakfast sandwiches to fuel them through the cold day ahead. The office workers followed, looking harried and checking their phones constantly, the kind of urban professionals who treated every minor inconvenience as a personal affront. Among them came a face Sarah didn't recognize, a woman in her 40s with the kind of expensive haircut and tailored coat that announced financial success from across the room. She moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having doors opened and tables made available. But her eyes held something harder than mere privilege. She surveyed the diner with the calculating gaze of a land developer eyeing prime real estate. "Table for one," the woman announced, not asked, settling into a booth near the window without waiting for Sarah's response. Her voice carried the crisp authority of boardrooms and conference calls, each word precisely enunciated and delivered with the expectation of immediate compliance. "Of course," Sarah replied, grabbing a menu from the counter. "Coffee?" "I suppose, though I doubt it will meet my usual standards." The woman didn't look up from her phone, fingers flying over the screen with the focused intensity of someone conducting business at the speed of light. "I'm Victoria Sterling, by the way. I'll be spending quite a bit of time in this neighborhood over the next few weeks." The name meant nothing to Sarah, but she caught Thomas's reaction in her peripheral vision, a sudden stillness, like prey recognizing a predator's scent on the wind. His coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, and his eyes fixed on Victoria Sterling with an intensity that transformed his entire demeanor. "Sterling Development," Thomas said quietly, though his voice carried clearly across the diner. "I should have expected you'd show up eventually." Victoria's head snapped up, her phone forgotten as she focused on the man with the crutches sitting by the opposite window. For a moment, her polished composure slipped, revealing something that might have been surprise or recognition. "Do we know each other?" she asked, though her tone suggested she was already calculating angles and advantages, treating even casual conversation as a negotiation. "We've never been formally introduced, but I'm familiar with your work, the Riverside apartment complex that displays 300 families, the community center you demolished to build luxury condos, the homeless camp you had cleared with 24 hours notice last winter." Victoria's smile is sharp enough to cut glass. "Progress requires difficult decisions.
I can't be responsible for every person who refuses to adapt to changing circumstances. Sarah felt the temperature in the diner drop, even though it had nothing to do with the weather outside. Other customers began to take notice, conversations quieting as they sensed conflict brewing between the well-dressed woman and the man with the crutches, who suddenly seemed far more formidable than his circumstances suggested. Detective Rodriguez chose that moment to arrive, his cop instincts immediately registering the tension crackling between the two tables. He settled into his usual booth, but kept his attention focused on the developing situation, one hand casually resting near his radio. "And you are?" Victoria asked Thomas, her tone suggesting she was already bored with the conversation but curious enough to gather intelligence. "Someone who's seen the cost of your kind of progress. Someone who's learned that efficiency isn't the same thing as humanity." How philosophical. Victoria returned her attention to her phone with dismissive finality. "I am sure your insights into business and development are fascinating, but I have actual work to do." Sarah found herself caught in the crossfire of an exchange she didn't fully understand, but whose implications felt immense. She'd served both kindness and cruelty across these tables, but this felt different, larger, more consequential than personal dramas or individual struggles. "What kind of work?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Something in Thomas's reaction to Victoria Sterling had awakened a protective instinct she didn't know she possessed.
Victoria looked up again, this time focusing on Sarah with a kind of attention that felt like being examined under a microscope. Urban renewal. This area has tremendous potential once we clear out the obstacles. Obstacles. Marcus Rodriguez's voice carried the flat authority of 18 years in law enforcement. "What kind of obstacles are we talking about, Miss Sterling?" "Obsolete businesses, substandard housing, populations that drain public resources without contributing to economic growth." Victoria's words were chosen with the precision of someone who'd given this speech many times before. Places like this diner, for instance. Prime real estate wasted on establishments that barely generate enough revenue to justify their existence. Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows. She looked around the diner, at Betty Morrison reading her newspaper and making her morning coffee last an hour, at the construction workers planning their day over hearty breakfasts, at Thomas watching the exchange with growing intensity. These weren't obstacles. They were people living their lives, creating community in small but meaningful ways. "This diner has been here for 22 years, Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "People depend on it. Mel employs 8 people. Families eat here, friends meet here, deals get made, and stories get told. That has to count for something." Victoria's laugh was silk wrapped around steel. "Sentimentality doesn't pay property taxes, dear. When the City Council votes to approve our development proposal next month, establishments like this will have 6 months to relocate or close. I'd suggest you start updating your resume." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Sarah felt the room spinning slightly. The security she'd built around this job, this routine, this small corner of stability dissolving like sugar in rain. 6 months. After 4 years of reliable work, dependable income, and carefully budgeted survival, she had 6 months to figure out what came next. "What kind of development?" Thomas asked, his voice carrying a dangerous quiet that made Sarah think of storm clouds gathering on distant horizons. "Luxury mixed use," Victoria replied, pulling out a tablet and swiping through architectural renderings with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd reduced human displacement to PowerPoint presentations. 40-story residential tower, high-end retail on the ground floor, corporate offices in the mid-levels. Sterling Pinnacle downtown. It will transform this entire district." She turned the tablet toward the room like a teacher showing slides to reluctant students. The renderings showed gleaming glass and steel, manicured landscaping, and people who looked like they'd stepped out of fashion magazines. There was no trace of Mel's diner, no suggestion that working-class families ever lived or worked in this space. 40 stories, Marcus repeated, his cop mind automatically calculating the impact on traffic patterns, emergency response times, infrastructure strain.
That's going to require significant zoning changes. Already approved by the Planning Commission, Victoria said with smug satisfaction. The City Council vote is merely a formality. Mayor Hendricks has been very supportive of projects that increase the tax base and attract high-income residents. Sarah watched Thomas's face as Victoria spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened at certain phrases, the way his hands gripped his coffee cup when she mentioned the mayor's name. There was history there, layers of story that went deeper than casual concern for urban development. "Where will people go?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "The families who live in the apartments above the shops? The people who work in the businesses you're going to demolish?" "That's not really my concern," Victoria replied, with the casual cruelty of someone who learned to treat human displacement as an externality to be managed rather than a consequence to be prevented. "The market will provide alternatives. People adapt." "The market," Thomas repeated, his voice carrying decades of accumulated bitterness. "The same market that has created tent cities under every overpass? The same market that makes teachers choose between rent and groceries?" Victoria finally looked directly at Thomas, really seeing him for the first time. Her eyes traveled from his worn clothes to his scarred hands, to the crutches leaning against his chair, cataloging details with the calculating gaze of someone assessing threat levels. "What exactly would you suggest as an alternative?" she asked, with the patronizing tone reserved for people whose opinions carried no economic weight. "Should we preserve urban decay in the name of nostalgia? Should profitable development be sacrificed to subsidize failure?" The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in challenge. Sarah found herself holding her breath, sensing that something significant was about to happen, though she couldn't predict what form it would take.
Thomas rose slowly from his chair, the movement deliberate and controlled despite the apparent limitation of his crutches. He moved with the kind of presence that filled space beyond his physical boundaries, authority radiating from him like heat from a furnace. "I would suggest," he said, approaching Victoria's table with measured steps, "that true development considers all stakeholders, not just the ones who can afford to buy their way to the table." Stakeholders. Victoria's smile was sharp enough to draw blood. A quaint business school term. "Tell me, do you have any actual experience in development, or are you just another bleeding heart who thinks good intentions can replace market realities?" Sarah saw something shift in Thomas's expression, a transformation so complete it was like watching a mask fall away to reveal the face beneath. The deference and uncertainty that had characterized his manner for months dissolved, replaced by something that made Victoria Sterling unconsciously lean back in her booth. "I have some experience," Thomas said quietly. 23 years building companies from the ground up. 15 years as CEO of Meridian Holdings. 7 years on the City Planning Commission before my accident. I know exactly how these deals get made, Victoria, and I know exactly what they cost. The silence that followed was profound enough to swallow sound. Sarah felt her world tilt on its axis as information she couldn't process fell into place like pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known she was solving. Meridian Holdings. She'd heard that name before, seen it on building signs and newspaper headlines. One of the largest development companies in the region, known for innovative design and community partnerships. Victoria Sterling's composure cracked like ice under pressure. Her tablet slipped from suddenly nerveless fingers, clattering against the table as she stared at Thomas with something approaching recognition. "Thomas Whitmore," she whispered, the name emerging like a confession pulled from unwilling lips. "You're supposed to be dead." "Reports of my death," Thomas replied with grim humor, "have been greatly exaggerated, though I can understand why certain people might prefer to believe otherwise." Marcus Rodriguez was on his feet now, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon as the tension in the room escalated beyond the realm of casual disagreement. Other customers were beginning to notice the drama unfolding,
conversations dying as attention focused on the confrontation between the well-dressed woman and the man who suddenly seemed far more dangerous than his crutches suggested. "This is impossible," Victoria said, her voice carrying the stunned disbelief of someone whose carefully constructed reality was crumbling in real time. "The accident, the explosion at the construction site. They said you died in the hospital. There was a funeral. I attended the funeral." "You attended the funeral of Thomas Whitmore, CEO and public figure," Thomas replied, settling back into his chair with the controlled movements of someone who'd learned to husband his strength. "But Thomas Whitmore the man survived, though he lost a great deal in the process. His company, his reputation, his family, everything that defined his identity was stripped away." Sarah found herself gripping the back of a chair for support, her mind reeling as she tried to reconcile the broken man who'd been nursing coffee at her table for months with the corporate titan he claimed to have been. The compass he'd given her suddenly took on new significance, not just a trinket from a grateful homeless man, but a piece of history from someone who'd once commanded boardrooms and shaped skylines. "If you're really Thomas Whitmore," Victoria said, her voice gaining strength as her lawyer instincts kicked in, "then you know the game as well as I do. You know that sentiment doesn't stop progress, that individual stories don't override economic necessity." "I know that version of the game. I played it for 23 years. I convinced myself that the greater good justified individual sacrifice, that efficiency was more important than empathy. Do you know what changed my mind?" Victoria shook her head, though Sarah doubted she really wanted to hear the answer. "Waking up in a hospital bed with a crushed spine and no visitors. Discovering that 23 years of business relationships had evaporated the moment I couldn't sign checks or approve projects. Learning that the empire I'd built was nothing more than a house of cards held together by the fiction of indispensability." He paused, his eyes finding Sarah's across the room. "And then spending 2 years on the streets, invisible to the same people who once competed for my attention, learning what it feels like to be an obstacle rather than an asset." Sarah felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, not from sadness, but from a complex mixture of emotions she couldn't name: anger at the injustice of Thomas's fall, admiration for his survival, and something that might have been hope at the possibility that power could be reclaimed and redirected. "Even if what you're saying is true," Victoria said, rallying her defenses like a general regrouping after an unexpected assault, "you have no company, no resources, no legal standing to oppose this development. You're a cautionary tale, no more."
"Actually," Thomas said, reaching into his jacket pocket and pulling out a sealed envelope, "I have something better than resources. I have information." He placed the envelope on Victoria's table with the kind of deliberate care usually reserved for legal documents or diplomatic ultimatums. Victoria stared at it as if it might explode. "Financial records," Thomas explained conversationally. "Specifically, documentation of the bribes Sterling Development paid to fast-track the zoning approvals for this project, payment schedules to Planning Commission members, campaign contributions to Mayor Hendricks that exceeded legal limits, and records of the shell companies used to hide the paper trail." Victoria's face went white. "That's impossible. Those records were destroyed?" Thomas smiled with genuine warmth for the first time since the conversation began. "You destroyed the records in your possession, but you forgot that I still had friends in the industry, people who remembered that Thomas Whitmore once knew how to build things instead of just tearing them down." Sarah watched this exchange with growing amazement, beginning to understand that she was witnessing something far more significant than a chance encounter between former business rivals. This was a chess match 20 moves deep, played with consequences that would ripple far beyond the confines of Mel's diner. "What do you want?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want you to withdraw the development proposal. I want you to return the bribes to their sources and face whatever legal consequences follow. And I want you to leave this neighborhood alone." "And if I refuse?" Thomas gestured toward Detective Rodriguez, who had been listening to the entire exchange with the focused attention of someone whose job involved distinguishing between truth and deception. "Then I give these documents to Detective Rodriguez, who I'm sure will find them interesting reading. The FBI has been looking into municipal corruption for months. This would give them exactly the evidence they need to start making arrests." Victoria Sterling sat in silence for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table as she calculated odds and consequences. Sarah could almost see the cost-benefit analysis running behind her eyes, the kind of cold calculation that reduced human lives to line items in a balance sheet. "You're bluffing," Victoria said finally. "If you really had evidence that could destroy me, you would have used it already." "Would I?" Thomas asked mildly. "Or would I wait for the perfect moment to maximize impact? You see, Victoria, there's something else you forgot about Thomas Whitmore. He was always very good at timing." As if on cue, the diner's TV flickered to life in the corner, the morning news beginning with a lead story that made every conversation stop mid-sentence. The anchor's voice carried clearly across the suddenly silent room. "Good morning. We begin today with breaking news about alleged corruption in city government. FBI agents this morning raided the offices of Sterling Development and arrested several city officials in connection with an ongoing bribery investigation." Victoria Sterling's coffee cup slipped from nerveless fingers, shattering against the floor in a spray of ceramic and liquid that seemed to echo through the stunned silence. Her carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, broadcast on live television for everyone to see. "You see," Thomas said gently, "I didn't need to give the documents to Detective Rodriguez. I gave them to the FBI 3 days ago. This morning's arrests are just the beginning." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet as she watched Victoria Sterling, powerful, arrogant, seemingly untouchable, crumble under the weight of consequences, finally catching up with ambition unchecked by conscience. But more than that, she was witnessing the transformation of Thomas from broken victim to strategic mastermind, a revelation that changed everything she thought she knew about power, justice, and the possibility of redemption. The morning that had begun with thoughts of lost dreams and limited options had become something else entirely, a demonstration that sometimes the most powerless people are simply powerful people waiting for the right moment to reclaim their strength. And Sarah was beginning to understand that her own story was far from over. The shattered coffee cup on the floor seemed to mark the moment when everything Sarah thought she understood about her world cracked open like an egg, revealing truths that had been hiding in plain sight for months. Victoria Sterling sat frozen in her booth, her perfectly styled hair slightly disheveled, her commanding presence deflated like a punctured balloon as the television continued its relentless coverage of the FBI raids. Detective Rodriguez was the first to move, approaching Thomas's table with the measured steps of someone whose profession had taught him to expect surprises, but rarely ones of this magnitude. His weathered face showed a mixture of professional curiosity and personal respect as he extended his hand. "Mr. Whitmore," he said formally, "I think we need to talk." Thomas accepted the handshake with the kind of firm grip that suggested he was remembering how to be someone who mattered again. "I've been waiting for this conversation for 2 years, Detective Rodriguez, though I admit I pictured it happening under different circumstances." Sarah found herself drawn closer to their exchange, her usual deference to law enforcement overwhelmed by a desperate need to understand how her quiet morning routine had exploded into federal investigations and corporate downfall.
The other customers in the diner seemed equally magnetized by the drama, their own breakfasts forgotten as they witnessed what felt like a scene from a political thriller. "The FBI contacted our department last week," Marcus explained, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone walking through a minefield of jurisdictional complexity. "They asked us to keep an eye out for certain individuals who might surface in connection with their investigation. Your name was on that list." "I imagine it was, though I suspect they listed me as a potential witness rather than a suspect." "They did. What they didn't mention was that you'd been living on the streets for 2 years, or that everyone believed you were dead." Marcus pulled out a small notebook, his cop instincts taking over despite the surreal nature of the situation. "Want to tell me how a dead man ends up having coffee in a downtown diner while his former industry colleagues get arrested?" Thomas glanced around the room, his eyes lingering on Sarah's face before returning to the detective. "It's a long story, detective, and not a particularly pleasant one." "I've got time," Marcus said, settling into the chair across from Thomas. "And right now, I'm thinking this might be the most important story I hear all year." Sarah realized she was holding her breath as Thomas began to speak, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been waiting 2 years to tell the truth to someone with the authority to act on it. The accident at the Riverside construction site wasn't an accident. The building collapsed because Sterling Development cut corners on materials and inspections. When I threatened to go public with evidence of their safety violations, they decided I was too dangerous to leave alive. The words hit the room like a physical force. Sarah felt her knees weaken and gripped the back of a nearby chair for support. She'd been serving coffee to a man who'd survived a murder attempt, someone whose very existence was evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of city government. Victoria Sterling, who had remained silent since the television broadcast began, suddenly came alive with desperate energy. "That's impossible. You're delusional. The investigation showed structural failure due to soil conditions." "The investigation was compromised from the beginning. The lead inspector was on Sterling Development's payroll. The soil reports were falsified. The materials testing was never completed." He reached into his jacket again, this time producing a thick manila folder that he placed on the table between himself and Detective Rodriguez. 23 workers were injured in that collapse. 3 died. Among them was Maria Santos, a single mother of 2 who was working overtime to pay for her daughter's medical treatments. Sarah recognized the name from newspaper coverage she'd read months ago, though she hadn't connected it to Thomas's story. Maria Santos had become a symbol of workplace safety advocacy, her photograph appearing in labor union newsletters and safety regulation campaigns. The idea that Thomas had known her personally, that her death was connected to his own near murder, added layers of tragedy to an already devastating revelation. "I had copies of all the original reports hidden in a safety deposit box. When I woke up in the hospital and learned about the cover-up, I knew I had 2 choices: disappear and let them think they'd succeeded, or surface immediately and probably end up actually dead." "So you chose to disappear," Marcus said, his voice carrying understanding rather than judgment.
"I chose to survive long enough to gather more evidence. Sterling Development thought they'd eliminated their problem when Thomas Whitmore died in that hospital. They got careless, sloppy. They left digital trails that a dead man couldn't pursue, but a living ghost could follow." Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process the implications of what Thomas was revealing. The man she'd been serving coffee to for months hadn't just been homeless. He'd been conducting a 2-year undercover investigation into municipal corruption while living on the streets, surviving on the charity of people like her while he built a case that could bring down an entire network of bribery and fraud. "How?" she asked, the question escaping before she could stop herself.
How do you investigate corporate crime when you don't have access to computers or phones or anything? Thomas smiled at her with genuine warmth, the same expression she'd seen when he'd watched children playing in the street or when she'd brought him soup without being asked. You'd be amazed what people will say around someone they consider invisible, Sarah. And you'd be surprised how many of my former colleagues retained enough conscience to help a dead man seek justice. Detective Rodriguez was writing rapidly in his notebook, stopping occasionally to ask clarifying questions about dates, locations, and names. Sarah could see him mentally constructing the timeline of evidence that would need to be verified, witnesses that would need to be interviewed, and charges that would need to be filed. The explosion at the construction site, Marcus said, looking up from his notes. If that wasn't an accident, we're talking about attempted murder charges in addition to the bribery and fraud. Multiple counts of attempted murder, Thomas corrected. I wasn't the only person they tried to silence. Robert Chen, the city inspector who first discovered the safety violations, died in a car accident 3 weeks after filing his report. Jennifer Martinez, the materials engineer who refused to falsify the testing data, was found dead in her apartment from an apparent overdose, despite having no history of drug use. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as the scope of the conspiracy Thomas was describing expanded beyond corporate corruption into something approaching organized crime. People had died to protect Sterling Development's profits, and Thomas had survived only by becoming invisible, by trading his identity for the chance to eventually seek justice. Why now? Victoria Sterling asked suddenly, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity beneath the desperation. If you've been planning this for 2 years, why surface now? Why not wait longer? Gather more evidence? Thomas turned to face her directly, and Sarah saw something in his expression that went beyond anger or revenge, a kind of moral clarity that made him seem larger than his physical presence. Because yesterday I watched you dismiss Sarah and everyone else in this diner as obstacles to be removed. I spent 2 years learning what it means to be invisible, to be considered disposable by people who measure human worth in terms of economic productivity. I won't let you do to this community what you did to Riverside. The reference to Riverside sparked recognition in several customers who had been listening to the conversation with growing fascination. Betty Morrison, who had been sitting with her newspaper forgotten in her lap, suddenly spoke up with the clear voice of someone who'd been waiting decades to have her suspicions confirmed. Riverside, she said, pointing an arthritic finger at Victoria Sterling. My nephew lived there. Miguel Ramirez, apartment 4B. He told me the building started showing cracks weeks before it collapsed, but management said it was just settling. Miguel was one of the survivors, Thomas said gently. He's part of the wrongful death lawsuit against Sterling Development. His testimony helped me understand how the cover-up worked. Detective Rodriguez looked up from his notebook, with the expression of someone whose case was becoming more complex by the minute. How many people know you're alive? More than Sterling Development realized, but fewer than you might think. The FBI has been coordinating with a small network of former colleagues and safety advocates who've been helping me document the evidence. We've been planning this morning for 6 months. Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions as she listened to Thomas reveal the scope of his deception, admiration for his dedication to justice, anger at having been lied to for months, and something that might have been heartbreak at the realization that their friendship, or what she'd thought was friendship, had been built on a foundation of necessary lies. Sarah, Thomas said, as if reading her thoughts, I need you to understand that nothing about our relationship was calculated or false. When I first came here, it was just because you served good coffee and treated me with kindness. What happened between us, the conversations, the compass, the way you saw me as a human being rather than a problem to be solved, that was real.
But you lied to me, Sarah said, her voice carrying more hurt than anger. Every day, for months, you let me believe you were something you weren't. I let you believe I was broken, Thomas replied. I never told you I was worthless.
The man you've been serving coffee to, the one who's been grateful for your kindness and impressed by your strength, that's exactly who I am. The only difference is that I also happen to be someone who once had power and is about to have it again." Before Sarah could respond, the television drew their attention once more as the news anchor returned with an update on the developing story. The screen filled with footage of FBI agents leading city officials out of government buildings in handcuffs, followed by shots of Sterling Development's corporate headquarters surrounded by federal investigators. "In a related development," the anchor continued, "the FBI has announced that their investigation was aided by evidence provided by Thomas Whitmore, the former CEO of Meridian Holdings, who is believed to have died in a construction accident 2 years ago. Mr. Whitmore's apparent survival in cooperation with federal investigators suggests that the corruption scandal may be even more extensive than initially reported." Victoria Sterling made a sound that was part sob, part laugh, the noise of someone whose carefully constructed reality was collapsing in real time. "This will destroy everything," she whispered. "Not just my company, but every project, every deal, every relationship I've built over 15 years. "Good," said a voice from the back of the diner. Sarah turned to see Mel Kowalski emerging from the Petchin, his massive frame filling the doorway as he surveyed the scene with the satisfied expression of someone whose long-held suspicions had finally been vindicated. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to bring you people down." All eyes turned to the gruff diner owner, who rarely involved himself in customer conversations beyond taking orders and collecting payment. His presence in the dining room during business hours was so unusual that even regular customers stopped their conversations to listen. "You remember me, don't you, Victoria? Mel Kowalski, owner of Kowalski Construction. Your company destroyed my business in 1998 when you spread rumors about faulty work to steal the Riverside project." Victoria's face went white as recognition dawned. That was 25 years ago. That was business. "That was my life," replied Mel with quiet intensity. 47 employees lost their jobs when your lies made it impossible for me to get bonding for new projects. My wife Rosa had to go back to work as a seamstress to pay the mortgage. She worked until the day she died because I couldn't rebuild what you destroyed." Sarah felt the room's energy shift as other customers began to realize they were witnessing something unprecedented, not just the exposure of corporate corruption, but a reckoning decades in the making. The diner had become a courtroom where victims could finally confront their accusers, where justice, long delayed, was finally being served. Thomas watched this exchange with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning was unfolding exactly as intended. "Victoria, I think you're beginning to understand why I chose this particular moment and this particular place to resurrect myself." Detective Rodriguez closed his notebook and stood, his movement drawing everyone's attention back to the legal realities of the situation. "Miss Sterling, I'm going to need you to come with me for questioning. You're not under arrest at this time, but the FBI has requested that we detain you as a material witness." "This is harassment," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She was already reaching for her phone, probably to call the kind of high-powered attorney who specialized in defending the wealthy from the consequences of their actions. "Actually," Thomas said, producing yet another document from his seemingly inexhaustible jacket, "your phone won't work. The FBI obtained a warrant to freeze all Sterling Development accounts and communication systems as of 6 a.m. this morning. You'll find that your credit cards have also been suspended pending the investigation." The revelation that Victoria Sterling, powerful, connected, seemingly untouchable, was now as financially helpless as any of the people she'd displaced hit the room like a thunderclap. Sarah watched the woman who'd casually discussed destroying her livelihood just an hour earlier suddenly understand what it felt like to have control stripped away without warning. "How does it feel?" asked Betty Morrison, her voice carrying the accumulated wisdom of 73 years and the particular satisfaction of someone who'd lived long enough to see karma finally catch up to its targets. "How does it feel to be powerless?" Victoria Sterling had no answer. She followed Detective Rodriguez toward the door with the mechanical movements of someone whose world had been turned inside out in the space of a single conversation. As they reached the entrance,
she turned back toward Thomas one final time.
"This won't bring back the people who died," she said, her voice carrying what might have been genuine remorse for the first time since she'd entered the diner. "No," Thomas agreed, "but it might prevent others from dying in the future, and sometimes that's the best justice we can hope for." After they left, the diner fell into a silence that felt both profound and temporary, like the pause between lightning and thunder. Sarah stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by customers who were processing what they'd witnessed, trying to understand how their morning routine had become the setting for one of the most significant corruption busts in the city's history. "So," Mel said finally, returning to the kitchen with characteristic gruffness, "anyone want more coffee? Because I've got a feeling this is going to be a very long day." The laughter that followed was cathartic, releasing tension that had been building for months, years, decades. Sarah found herself laughing until tears ran down her cheeks, though she wasn't entirely sure whether they were tears of relief, joy, or overwhelming confusion about what came next. Thomas remained at his table, watching her with an expression of gentle concern. "Sarah," he said softly, "are you all right?" The question was so absurd, given everything that had just happened, everything that had been revealed, everything that would never be the same again, that it triggered another wave of laughter that bordered on hysteria. "Am I all right?" she managed to say between gasps. "The man I've been serving coffee to for months just turned out to be a corporate CEO who faked his own death to expose municipal corruption. The woman who was going to destroy my job just got arrested by the FBI. My entire understanding of reality has been turned upside down. So no, Thomas, I'm not all right. I'm completely, utterly, magnificently not all right." Thomas smiled, and for the first time since his revelation began, he looked truly happy. "Good, because normal was never going to be good enough for someone like you." 3 years later, Sarah stood in her white coat at the entrance of the new Whitmore Community Clinic, built where Sterling's luxury tower would have stood. Thomas approached, his limp barely noticeable now, carrying 2 cups of coffee from Mel's. "Still the best coffee in the city," he said, handing her one. "Still the best customer," she replied, though they both knew their relationship had evolved far beyond server and patron. The clinic served everyone, regardless of ability to pay, funded by the settlement from Sterling Development's conviction. Detective Rodriguez ran security, ensuring no one felt unsafe seeking care. Betty Morrison volunteered at reception, greeting patients with the same sharp wit she'd brought to her morning coffee for decades. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked, watching a mother bring her child through the clinic doors. Sarah touched the compass in her pocket, now polished to a shine. "None. Every path I took led here." Mel's Diner thrived next door, its neon sign a beacon for those seeking not just food, but community. The city had learned that true development meant lifting everyone up, not pushing anyone out. Sometimes the greatest transformations begin with the smallest acts of kindness, like serving coffee to a stranger with dignity and warmth.